everybody.
Yeah, ready.
Welcome to ID24. We're in hour number 6 of 24. Quick reminder, if you've got questions for our next speaker, or indeed any of the speakers throughout the rest of the 24 hours, you can tweet us with the hashtag ID24. So we'd love to hear your comments and questions. Our next speaker is Robert Jolly, who is product manager and project manager with lots of accessibility experience and more than 20 years experience working on the web in general. And he's going to be talking to us about shepherding your project team through the accessibility bits and pieces of a project. And he's going to present a framework that's going to enable everybody in your project team, led by the project manager, to think about accessibility, which is a really valuable component of getting accessibility right in any project. So over to you, Robert.
All right,
Make
thank
sure
you.
you'll switch your screen again, Robert.
All right, so I will start sharing the presentation now. And what I'm going to talk about is just what Leonie said. My experience with kind of leading teams through design and development projects with accessibility in mind. And I'll start by going through some typical roles that project managers and product managers play. You know, I've got a slide up here that basically shows kind of an old school Gantt chart from a waterfall project, and certainly this could be a Kanban board or anything else in the background. But basically, you know, project and product managers oversee the project timeline, the tasks, the deliverables. They're basically, you know, kind of the stewards of the project. They make sure that things get done. Accessibility doesn't really factor into project managers and product managers' official roles, you know, very often, at least not in my experience. Product and project managers manage communication, risk mitigation, resourcing and scheduling, the requirements and scope. You know, basically, you know, herding cats, you know, throughout the project, figuring out what's going to go wrong or what's going wrong and communicating that. So one of the things that I've come across is when it comes to accessibility, whose responsibility is it? You know, there are a lot of people that quickly lower their hands in a project meeting and says, it's not my job, it's not my role, and we all are learning that it's everyone's role. But project managers and product managers can really take the lead and help other people that aren't thinking about accessibility to really take that on and bring that skill set to their practice. So as a project manager, I've seen UX practitioners, people who do wireframes and designs, visual design, really work on accessibility that weren't ever formally exposed to it. I've seen developers come to me and ask me about accessibility after we bring this up and talk through what the project requirements are. So certainly we can take the lead and help our fellow teammates on projects. But the big question is, how do we do that? How do we embrace accessibility? How do we bring folks into this way of thinking that they haven't done before? Oftentimes they haven't done before. Sometimes folks have, and that's certainly a bonus when you're working with a team that is well versed in accessibility. But by and large, the number of projects that I've worked on where accessibility really wasn't thought of at the outset or even at all on a project has been, you know, has been a pretty large number. So project managers and product managers can really champion accessibility via, you know, four main concepts. That's cultivating empathy. You know, basically trying to get folks to understand how people who are different than them may use the web. So how people use assistive technology to help them access content and make purchases, participate in the full online society that we've been developing over the years. Project managers can also, by the nature of being kind of the keepers of requirements, can understand the accessibility requirements that are in play with any given project, and we'll talk more about what that is in a bit. PMs communicate risk in ways that other folks can't. So, knowing who to bring the risk to. So, you can figure out where things lie with design and development, and if there are risks associated to accessibility, and communicate that upstream so that things can be reprioritized if needed. And then, staying firm with all of the items that I just talked about, staying firm with cultivating empathy within the project team and the organization that you're working with, staying firm about the requirements, and then staying firm about the risks that are in play with accessibility can really help you successfully bridge that gap. With cultivating empathy, we're just really talking about connecting with others at a human level. There are a number of great talks and books on ways to cultivate empathy, but some of the really basic things that I try to do on a project team is to ask myself and ask the team that I'm working with, how can we relate to each person who's possibly using this site. So it doesn't have to be a person that's just like me. In fact, it's better that we think about people that are different than ourselves when we're cultivating empathy, so that we can try to get outside of the blinders that we put on as designers and developers. And so as a project manager, you can ask those questions of your teammates, like, how would someone using a screen reader access this content, or how would somebody who can only use a keyboard, or who might not be able to perceive colors as well as you, be able to use the site? And that puts that empathy in play in the project. So I've got a slide up here that has a lot of garbled text, but basically what I try to ask folks is, for instance, what would somebody who recently had a stroke and can't really spend a lot of time in the interface because of headaches, and that's actually something that happened to me. What would that be like? What would it be like for someone who is outside in bright sunlight and can't see the contrast between elements on the page? How would somebody who is on a mobile device and holding a sick child and only using one thumb to operate the website to, say, make an appointment or to make a purchase to help that sick child, what would that experience be like, and how could we help that person make that experience better? So when we cultivate empathy, we always try to be inquisitive and ask questions about, how can I understand more? How can I learn more about how this person might use our site? And then staying non-judgmental about it, meaning that this person is no less than us as far as design and development goes. We need to not judge them based on their ability or disability that they may have, and we need to validate what they are going through when they report problems, or when we figure out that hey, our stuff isn't keyboard accessible, so how do we make that keyboard accessible? Because there are real people out there that need this, and that plays into being compassionate as well. So those are the tools that I use to help teams cultivate empathy and really think about ways to approach inclusive design and making websites accessible. There are some other resources out there, to help you learn about accessibility. And I think a good place to start, and a good place that I always point folks to, are some of the stories, the user stories, and the use cases, and even business cases that are housed on the W3C Web Accessibility Initiative site. So that's always a great place to point folks, and there are a ton of other resources out there. And then when you're in doubt about anything, it's always great to ask for help. So there's a really strong accessibility community out there that's willing and able to answer questions and to provide quick support without really too many barriers. So if there's ever a question that your team member has that you can't answer, as a project manager or product manager, you can always reach out to the community and get help. And that's one of the great things I've found with the accessibility community in general. So one of the other ways that we deal with bringing people into accessibility as a project manager and a product manager is to really understand the requirements that are in the project brief that we're working on. So when I've worked with agencies, both small and large agencies, we'd often respond to RFPs or other kind of client-led, external client-led initiatives where they have a set of business goals and a number of requirements that are listed in a project RFP or brief, and one of the line items have been site must be made accessible, or site must be Section 508 compliant, or WCAG compliant. So it's not just a single line item requirement when you're talking about accessibility, and it's not just a river in Egypt that you can kind of deny and ignore. So really, unpacking the requirements is the first step in that. Really dig in and understand, okay, there are a number of guidelines that exist or laws that exist that reflect, that roll up into that one line that may be in the RFP that you're dealing with. So, as PMs, we are the keeper of requirements. So really expanding that and understanding how complex that might get with accessibility is going to be in our best interest and our team's best interest. So the next step after understanding what the guidelines are and unpacking the requirements is to take a look at the roles and responsibilities that exist for your teammates. Accessibility left at the very end is often an awful mistake to make. So when you can kind of understand which team members are best responsible for which meeting which guidelines or use case in making your site accessible, say color contrast and proximity issues being the kind of the domain of the visual designer, having that taken care of early on in the project, and then allowing the developers time to code things properly with respect to keyboard accessibility and understanding different ARIA roles and landmarks that need to be in play. That can help lighten the load and not have a lot of rework at the end. So there's a great resource out there for for the for the roles and responsibilities, I think it's the WCAG 2 Quick Reference Guide from the W3C that really lets you kind of slice and dice those requirements by role or by content type, and it can give project managers a head start in understanding how to address accessibility at different stages in the project, and then with understanding requirements, just communicate early and often about those requirements. Make sure that folks understand that that this is part of the project that you're working on. The empathy building certainly will help, and you can back that up with the requirements that you have as well, so that you have a pretty solid stance for accessibility moving forward. So with PMs, risk mitigation is a big part of the job. Understanding the scope and understanding risk of not meeting a deadline or not meeting a requirement, and there are some outside risks that PMs can help folks become aware of, and that's with accessibility. If you ignore certain accessibility problems, you can face significant legal risks as an organization, or your clients can. So communicating that to the proper folks early on in the project will help you adjust the scope as needed if it hadn't been accounted for initially. So as a PM, when you start to unpack those accessibility requirements, and that work hadn't been factored in, or there's already been work that's been done that has contributed to accessibility problems, then communicating that risk back to some of the executive stakeholders that are responsible ultimately for the project will help you get buy more time, buy more resources to address things properly. So making sure that those executive stakeholders are also on board with accessibility is a role that PMs can play. So another aspect of that communication of risk is reporting accessibility progress as you go. So making sure that you're testing early and often, especially in an agile environment. You should be able to fold testing right in with other functional tests that you're doing, or test-driven development work that's happening. And then, if you feel like you're over your head as a PM in terms of accessibility, and sometimes that can certainly happen, just being aware of that and knowing that, when you're feeling like things are a little beyond the scope of what your knowledge or experience is for accessibility, you can ask for help. There are certainly a number of consulting firms and accessibility subject matter experts that are available to assist in a professional capacity as well as an informal capacity on projects. So when you're feeling like the risks are great, it may be time to ask for help with an outside resource. And then that last principle for PMs in terms of accessibility is just to stay firm. You do have the power to be firm about accessibility, and I've seen this play out on projects where I've been able to introduce the concept of accessibility early on in a project, and everyone agree to it. And then when the rubber hits the road and we're in the middle of the actual designing and developing of the thing, I can be very firm about the fact that we can't let accessibility slide. that we have to think about it. We have to address any issues that are coming up during the design and development, and make sure that when we launch that we've got things in a good place. So the ways that I do that is I always try to lead with the empathy exercises to refocus folks and efforts. So always use the carrot rather than the stick, and then the stick can be both the project requirements, but also escalating any issues or risks to the appropriate stakeholders to kind of reset priorities with the project from above if needed. That often isn't needed if I'm using empathy and project requirements effectively. So documenting those and communicating those are really key in remaining firm and helping to champion accessibility even in the face of adversity. So I'm wrapping up a little early, so I'd be interested in any questions or comments from folks. But my last slide is for my fellow cat herders that are PMs out there to go forth and to be champions for accessibility.
Brilliant, thanks, Robert. That was really, really interesting. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you great.
Great, thank you. I'm really interested, having done sort of some project management, work in my time. What kind of sort of got you focused on the accessibility angle?
So I was involved in a lot of web standards design and development through a shop that was kind of famous for that, and I was going to some conferences and I heard some folks speak about accessibility that turned me on to the idea of it. We had a client, the Lighthouse Foundation in New York City, to redesign their website. So that was an organization, or is an organization that helps people with low vision and blindness through services in that area, and they also are a part of a larger network that's kind of worldwide. But I got to experience someone using a screen reader for the first time in real life as a part of that project, and to understand how the decisions that we were making as designers and developers were affecting people in real life. So that turned me on to accessibility, but I still wasn't, I would call an accessibility champion at that point. I knew the importance, and I wanted to make sure that everyone had access to the promise of the web, but it wasn't until about 4.5 years ago I had a stroke, and I was relatively healthy. I was 40 years old. I did lots of endurance athletic events like ultra running and triathlons, and after I had the stroke, I had a temporary disability that it basically, I had these headaches that just would not go away for about a month or so. Maybe I think it was around 6 weeks of headaches, and I just couldn't use the web. And I had been involved in the web industry for a long time, so that made it very, very difficult for me. And at that point, I think was really when things changed for me in terms of really wanting to make sure that accessibility was a part of my practice, and trying to take that to as many folks as possible.
Yep, that makes complete sense, and I think it's interesting, that often there's a personal experience that gets people involved for the first time, but actually for just as many people, I think actually if we look around at the people we know, our friends, our family, you really quickly start to realize how many people accessibility really does affect. and quite what a positive difference you can make if you kind of turn your attention to this sort of stuff. Is that generally how you feel about working in accessibility?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that there are a number of folks that work in the accessibility industry that haven't had that personal experience as far as something happening to them, but through exposure to other people and how they use the web, that's really helped them to broaden their understanding and their ability to help other people. So that's been something that I've experienced for sure, and even going to accessibility focused conferences where you have a number of people that are using assistive technologies or experiencing the web in different ways, that has helped me to to kind of build that empathy and to take that back to teams that I'm working with and say, okay, well, I met Shauna at this conference, and she had a combination of kind of extreme low vision and hard of hearing that made it very interesting how she used the web and very different than what we as a team use, how we experience the web. So how can we help accommodate that in using our design and development skills to both make this product, this website very attractive, but very, very functional at the same time, and not exclude anyone. And so having those very very specific stories to take back to teams has been super helpful for me.
That's a really interesting thing. Do you think sort of being able to kind of tell stories and kind of pick up a narrative helps people in project teams understand what otherwise might be a bit of an unfamiliar or perhaps even a little bit of a scary topic?
Yes, absolutely, and that's putting a personal touch to how people use the web. It's not just someone that's someone off in the distance that's different than us. So I was speaking with a designer not too long ago, and we were going over some of the early design concepts for a website, and some of the color contrast wasn't great. It wasn't the worst I've ever seen, but we know how designers love gray text on white or light gray backgrounds. So that's a problem. But what I tried to do was to understand the designer's intent in making something that low of contrast, and what their intention was to basically de-emphasize one piece of it, but not make it go away. And so I said, well, for some people, and for this person in particular, this they're not going to be able to perceive that content that you've de-emphasized, but you don't want it to go away. Otherwise, you just wouldn't have it on there. And it's not
Right.
decorative; it's definitely functional. So, what if we reshape the parameters around this, where we can bump up the contrast, but maybe do something different? And we started talking about design constraints. And at first, it wasn't an easy conversation to have, but then as time went on, I feel like they came around to that idea, and actually in a more recent conversation with this designer, they were asking me about ways that we could really make some great, very inventive, accessible things happen with this design. So they were actually starting to challenge me in terms of what can we do to really make this a showcase, not just kind of visually, but and functionally for people that don't have a disability, but how can we take that creativity to a very extreme accessibility level. So that was really heartening to hear that, because I know that I've won them over in some way through other people's stories.
Yep, I think it's one of those pivotal moments, isn't it, when you suddenly realise that, you know, a team that perhaps at the start were unsure or, you know, even a little bit reluctant to think about accessibility, suddenly, you know, grasp it and actually see it as a positive challenge, some way to, you know, exercise their own kind of creativity and innovation. I think that's a really positive step forward.
Absolutely.
I know you've worked with a lot of clients, you know, some really well-known names like American Airlines and Zappos. Are there any kind of common themes across different size and shape project teams or different project methodologies in terms of accessibility?
Well, I would say the one thing that I've seen that's been, I think it's probably echoed with a lot of folks in the industry itself, but that folks that come into the web design and development industry as designers or developers don't get a lot of formal training on accessibility. So they come in, you know, without a lot of knowledge, and you know, I don't want to say it's, I mean, it's an ignorance of accessibility, but it's not a willful one. I think it's one just that's more systematic. So that I've seen that has contributed to a lot of problems with accessibility. But where I have seen really good success with some of these larger clients is they have multiple teams working on things, but once one team kind of catches on to really how to distribute the accessibility workload amongst their teams, and that's usually, you know, a really good Scrum Master or product manager or both that are on a team or several teams. They can really, you know, kind of infect folks with this accessibility bug that's a really good thing. So I'm not saying that PMs are the key to all of this, but I think they can play a vital role, and that's one thing that I've seen. You know, once folks really get turned on to accessibility for whatever reason, whether it's a legal reason, you know, a fear reason, I've seen organizations embrace accessibility obviously for doing the right thing to make things more usable for everyone. But for whatever reason, once folks get a hold of that and they see that it's a distributed responsibility instead of something that's just done at the end, like, you know, we're going to test this after we launch, or we're going to test this in QA, and we're going to task our QA team with all of this, then, you know, that's, if people aren't doing that, if people are distributing that workload, then that's where I've seen the most success. Yeah. And I've seen really innovative stuff happen. So, you know, that's always great to see that.
Yeah, I love the way you refer to it as, you know, infectious. You know, I was thinking the word in my mind as you were speaking was it's contagious. You know, if one developer or project manager or designer on a team, you know, has knowledge of accessibility and is really enthusiastic about it, I think it tends to make everybody else on the team kind of think, well, hey, they obviously know something. I don't know that. Perhaps it's something I ought to, you know, get my head around, get educated on, and so it kind of rolls on. I think it's a really good effect. And have you had much experience of working in different project sort of methodologies, agile as opposed to waterfall? And
yes, both. And I've seen it work in both environments. So, you know, there are still some teams that I work with that are using some waterfall methodologies and waterfall approaches to projects, but then other teams using agile that I think there are ways to bake accessibility into just about any methodology if you're thinking about it from the outset. So, you know, exploring role-based responsibilities within a project team for accessibility is a great thing to do. And I know that Denis Boudreau likes to, he talks a lot about and teaches about role-based accessibility breakdowns. So that's something that really resonates with me in terms of how to really pay attention to that and divide and conquer on making things accessible. I know that there are a few questions from Twitter as well. So maybe let's see.
Oh, let me just check in on that.
So yeah, there's one from Michelle Collier. As a PM, what is a good technique for assigning accessibility responsibilities when teams are resistant? And I think my answer to that would be basically going through each kind of each aspect of accessibility requirements. So thinking of designers and what aspects of accessibility apply to what they're doing and when they're doing it, but doing that kind of ahead of time as a PM. So so when you're thinking about, well, when are we going to be working on design of this particular feature? What do we need to be thinking of? So educating them on the use of color in particular is a big one. Not using color alone for meaning. I also like to ask designers early on to start thinking about designing different states for things. So designing focus states, just like they're doing hover states, and maybe they're going to be mostly the same, but there may be some instances where a hover state and a focus state are different. Designing for bypass blocks like skip links and other kind of navigational aids. Making sure that obviously color contrast is dealt with. So and when they're resistant, it really just it has to fall back to requirements. So I always say let's lead with empathy, but then the requirements are there for a reason. So if we need to go back to the line item in the brief that says, and we're going to make this accessible, saying, well, what you're doing here, if you're being resistant, is not making it accessible, so that's not going to meet the requirements. And being firm about it, but also trying not to make enemies, I think is important in that regard.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good tip. Something actually I'd be really interested to get your thoughts on is I was talking to some people recently, and the subject came up. What do you do when accessibility is not in the client brief, or it hasn't really been sort of factored into the project in a big way? And my response was just go for it anyway. Stealthy accessibility is a good thing, and I bet the people I was talking to a pint that nobody will ever pick you up and complain that you've made something too accessible. Do you think that's a valid approach in those situations?
I think it's a totally valid approach. The thing that I always wonder about with that approach is if the team is willing, let's do it. If the team is unwilling for some reason, if they have that resistance because they feel like it takes more time or it takes more effort, it really doesn't. But the thing that I would do as well is, if it's not in the requirements, is to bring up the awareness of any kind of legal risks. So what could the client, if they left that out of the brief, what could they face as far as any legal ramifications if they did that? Because our laws are changing and evolving and getting stronger in support of accessibility on the web for just about any site at this point. But there are also a number of legal cases that really show that you don't have to have a government mandate to be accessible to actually face penalties for not being accessible in court, at least. So those can be pretty substantial. So the fear tactic isn't necessarily one that I would want to do. I mean, I would love to work with a team on something stealthily, even if the client didn't want it. So there was a client that I had a number of years ago. It was an arts organization, and they were well funded. They had a well-known brand designer come up with their logo, and even kind of contributed to what the site should look like and do. But we were tasked with the website project, and you know, because they were a community organization that was arts focused, I thought, well, you know, let's bring up accessibility in this meeting. We haven't heard from them about this, but we've been asked to do this big, and this is a number of years ago, so Flash was still a thing, and mobile devices, iOS hadn't completely caught on at the time, but we knew that was a thing that was right around the corner as well. Like, we all had our iPhones, and I think this was right before the famous, you know, we're not going to support Flash on iOS statement from Steve Jobs. But and you can still make Flash accessible. It's work, but you can do it. And one of the big things was they wanted almost an entirely Flash-based homepage. And we were talking about ways that we could make the Flash thing happen, but using progressive enhancement, we could also make it accessible. And so that folks who couldn't use a mouse or were using a screen reader or whatever, basically that content and that functionality would still be there, so people wouldn't just get lost from the homepage. And this is one case where I wish we had done something stealthily, because the director of the arts organization just shut us down and said, no, we don't care about accessibility. We're an arts organization. And I'm like, oh, that was the moment where I knew nothing I could do would sell this person on this. And they were the ultimate decision maker. So, you know, I wish we had gone and done that stealthily at the time. So yes, I'm all for that. whenever possible, and whenever practical.
I think any of us who've spent more than 5 minutes thinking about accessibility have all been in exactly that position at some point or the other. But on the other hand, if we want to look at how far accessibility has come over the past 15 or 20 years, then the almost total lack of Flash splash pages and home pages is probably a pretty damn good sign that we're making progress.
It's a wonderful thing.
Yes. And on that note, Robert, thank you ever so much. That was a brilliant talk and a great conversation with you afterwards. Thank you so much for being part of this. And everybody else will be back with talk number 7 in about 20 minutes' time.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert.
Thanks, Robert. And we'll be back soon in about 15 minutes with Michiel Bell, who has changed his title to a new one, which we're all going to find out what it is when it starts. Take care.